What happens when a man known for calm wisdom walks into a room built for noise, interruption, and applause, and decides he's had enough? The studio lights were already blazing, the audience buzzing with expectation, when Morgan Freeman took his seat at the long, polished table of the view, unaware that within minutes the entire room would fall into a silence, so heavy it would feel scripted, rehearsed, almost unreal. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to Talk Flair, like this video, and drop a comment right now, because moments like this don't just happen, they explode, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The applause rolled in waves as Morgan smiled politely, that familiar half-grin etched by decades of storytelling, struggle, and survival. He nodded to the hosts, exchanged soft greetings, his voice low, respectful, controlled. To the audience, he looked relaxed. To the cameras, he looked legendary. But inside, there was a tightening, a subtle awareness that this wasn't going to be just another promotional interview. He had done enough of those to know the difference. There was an edge in the air, a tension masked by laughter and makeup. The first questions were gentle, predictable. Career reflections. Legacy. His iconic voice. Morgan answered with grace, choosing words carefully, weaving warmth into every sentence. The audience leaned in, soaking in every syllable. One of the hosts laughed loudly, cutting in before he could finish a thought, steering the conversation toward controversy, toward labels, toward opinions Morgan had addressed too many times before. He paused, just for a breath, then continued calmly, refusing to be rushed. The interruption passed, but something had shifted. Another host leaned forward, fingers tapping the table, eyes sharp. The question came wrapped in politeness, but carried a sting. It was about society, about responsibility, about blame. The kind of question designed not to listen, but to provoke. The audience murmured. Morgan's eyes flicked briefly across the panel, reading the room the way only a man who had survived decades in Hollywood could. He answered slowly, choosing honesty over comfort. A few claps broke out, quickly swallowed by chatter from the table. Then it happened again. Another interruption. A raised voice. A rebuttal before he'd even landed his point. The rhythm of the show accelerated, voices overlapping, the moment slipping away from substance into spectacle. Morgan leaned back slightly, his hands folding together. To the casual viewer, it looked like patience. To those watching closely, it was restraint. Inside, memories stirred. Not anger, not rage, but fatigue. The exhaustion of repeating himself to rooms that only wanted sound bites. He had marched, spoken, acted, and listened for longer than some of the people at the table had been alive. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He had learned long ago that the most powerful voice in the room is often the quietest one. The host pressed again, sharper now. But don't you think? Morgan raised a finger. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough. The studio froze. It was subtle, almost easy to miss. But the effect was immediate. One by one, the voices stopped. The host mid-sentence closed her mouth. Another leaned back, surprised. The audience fell into a hush so sudden you could hear fabric shift and breath catch. Morgan didn't speak right away. He let the silence breathe. He let it stretch until it became uncomfortable, until everyone realized they were waiting on him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unmistakably firm. "Let me finish," he said. Not shouted, not snapped, just stated. The words landed heavier than any raised voice ever could. Cameras zoomed in. A producer offstage stiffened. This wasn't in the rundown. This wasn't expected. Morgan leaned forward now, his gaze direct but not hostile. "If you invite someone to speak," he continued, "you owe them the respect of listening." No one interrupted. He went on carefully, deliberately. He spoke about nuance, about complexity, about the danger of turning real human struggles into talking points. Each sentence was measured, each pause intentional. The audience began to nod, some clapping softly, unsure if it was allowed. The hosts exchanged glances, suddenly aware of how small the table felt. One host attempted a nervous laugh, but it faded quickly. Morgan didn't smile. He wasn't angry. He was clear. "I've lived long enough," he said, "to know that shouting doesn't create truth. Listening does." The silence returned, deeper now, reverent. The kind of silence reserved for moments that people replay later and say, "That's when everything changed." Morgan finished his thought, folded his hands again, and leaned back. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't wait for applause. It came anyway. Not loud at first. Then stronger. The audience rose slightly in their seats, energy crackling. The The hosts clapped too, some out of respect, some out of reflex, some out of realization. The show moved on, but it wasn't the same. Something had been reset, recalibrated. And as the cameras cut to commercial, one thing was clear. Morgan Freeman hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. He hadn't stormed off. He had simply reminded everyone in that room what real authority sounds like. The commercial break ended, but the energy in the studio didn't reset the way it usually did. It lingered, thick and unsettled, like smoke after a fire alarm that everyone pretends didn't go off. Morgan Freeman sat quietly as the cameras rolled back in, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, almost meditative. Around him, the hosts adjusted their cue cards, cleared their throats, and smiled a little too tightly, aware that millions of viewers were now watching more closely than before. One of the hosts thanked him for his perspective, her voice softer than earlier, cautious. Another tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, mentioning an upcoming project, a film release, something neutral. Morgan nodded, appreciative of the attempt, but the shift felt forced, like taping over a crack in glass. The audience sensed it too. Their applause came quicker now, louder, as if they were compensating for the tension they didn't know how to release. Morgan answered the new question, speaking about storytelling, about responsibility, about why he still chose his roles carefully at this stage of his life. His words flowed smoothly, but beneath them was a current of resolve. He wasn't finished saying what needed to be said. Not yet. And whether the panel liked it or not, the space he'd created with that single raised finger hadn't closed. A different host leaned in, attempting to reassert control, her tone respectful but probing. But some people would argue, she began, choosing her words with care, that silence itself can be part of the problem. The audience murmured again. Morgan's eyes lifted, steady and unblinking. He didn't interrupt this time. He let her finish. When she did, the room waited. He smiled slightly, not amused, but understanding. Silence, he replied, is only dangerous when it's used to avoid truth. He paused, allowing the sentence to settle. But there's a difference between silence and listening. We confuse the two because listening requires patience, and patience isn't very popular on television. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, nervous but real. One host chuckled, then stopped herself, sensing the weight behind his words. Morgan continued, his voice gaining quiet momentum. He spoke about growing up in a world where speaking out carried consequences far greater than social media backlash. He spoke about learning when to speak, when to wait, and when to let actions speak louder than arguments. Each sentence felt like a lesson, not a lecture. As he talked, the panel grew still. No interruptions. No overlapping commentary. The cameras caught close-ups of faces shifting from defensive to thoughtful. One host nodded slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by reflection. Another glanced down at her notes, then back up, as if seeing him differently now. Morgan's thoughts drifted briefly inward. He remembered rooms where his voice had been ignored entirely, doors closed before he could knock. He remembered the long road to being heard, and how strange it felt now to command silence without demanding it. Power, he knew, wasn't volume. It was presence. The audience began applauding again, this time without hesitation. Morgan raised a hand gently, not to stop them, but to acknowledge them. I appreciate that, he said, but this isn't about applause. The clapping faded. It's about conversation. Real conversation. And real conversation means sometimes being uncomfortable. That word hung in the air. Uncomfortable. The show thrived on comfort disguised as conflict, on tidy disagreements resolved before the next commercial break. Morgan was offering something messier, something harder to package. One host finally spoke, her voice sincere now. So what do we do with that discomfort? She asked. The question wasn't a challenge. It was genuine. Morgan turned toward her fully, meeting her eyes. We sit with it, he said. We don't rush to fill the space. We ask ourselves why it bothers us. The audience was silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was attentive. Even the crew seemed still, the hum of the studio fading beneath the weight of the moment. Morgan leaned back, exhaling softly. He had said more in these few minutes than he'd planned, but he didn't regret it. The moderator glanced at the clock, then at the panel, then back to Morgan. Time was slipping, segments overlapping. She thanked him again, promising to continue the conversation after the break. Morgan nodded politely, but his eyes suggested he knew better. Some conversations don't pause neatly. They ripple outward. As the cameras cut away once more, the audience erupted into applause, louder than before, standing now, not because they were told to, but because it felt earned. Morgan stood briefly, offering a small bow of his head, then sat again. Off stage, producers whispered urgently, aware that something unscripted had just taken control of their show. The hosts gathered themselves, aware that the balance of the table had shifted. Morgan Freeman hadn't come to dominate. He'd come to speak. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful moment on television isn't a shouting match or a viral insult. It's a man choosing his words carefully, and a room choosing, finally, to listen. The next segment began with an energy that felt reshaped, as if the studio itself had shifted its posture. Morgan Freeman remained seated at the table, composed, his hands resting calmly, but the ripple he'd created was still moving through the room. The hosts returned from the break more measured now, voices steadier, smiles less performative. They knew the audience had felt it. They knew they couldn't rewind the moment or talk their way around it. The moderator opened with a careful tone, acknowledging the depth of the conversation without naming the tension outright. Morgan listened, nodding slightly, his gaze thoughtful. When another host offered a follow-up question, it wasn't framed as a challenge this time. It was framed as an invitation. That alone said everything about how the balance had changed. Morgan answered, his voice smooth but grounded, expanding on the idea of responsibility in public discourse. He spoke about the danger of reducing complex lives into arguments designed for applause. As he talked, he looked not just at the panel, but occasionally toward the audience, as if reminding everyone that these conversations didn't end when the cameras cut away. They followed people home. They shaped opinions. They lingered. One host tried to gently redirect again, suggesting that television thrives on urgency, on keeping things moving. Morgan smiled faintly, not dismissive, but knowing. Urgency has its place, he replied. But wisdom doesn't arrive on a deadline. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Even a few crew members exchanged glances, caught between professionalism and personal reaction. The discussion deepened, less combative now, more reflective. A host shared a personal experience, something vulnerable, something unscripted. Morgan listened intently, not interrupting, not preparing his response while she spoke. When she finished, he acknowledged her courage before responding, and that simple act shifted the tone yet again. It was no longer a panel versus a guest. It was a conversation. Inside, Morgan felt a quiet resolve. He hadn't planned to become the anchor of the episode, but he understood why it had happened. Moments like this weren't about ego. They were about timing. He had learned long ago that when a moment presents itself, you either honor it or you waste it. He had no interest in wasting this one. The audience reacted to every pause now, every inflection. They laughed when humor surfaced naturally. They leaned forward when the room grew serious. Social media teams backstage were already scrambling, clips being marked, producers whispering about how this would play online. But Morgan wasn't thinking about that. He was present fully, in a way that couldn't be clipped into something shallow. Another host attempted to push slightly, asking whether he thought shows like this one were part of the problem he was describing. The question was careful but loaded. The room tensed again, just a little. Morgan didn't hesitate. Anything that reaches millions of people carries responsibility, he said evenly. That includes this table. And it includes me. That answer disarmed the room. He wasn't placing blame. He was sharing it. One host exhaled, nodding slowly. That's fair, she said. The audience applauded softly, appreciative of the honesty on both sides. Time pressed forward, but no one rushed him now. The final minutes of the segment unfolded like a quiet reckoning. Morgan spoke about legacy, not just his own, but the legacy of conversations we choose to amplify. He spoke about younger generations watching, absorbing tone as much as content. They learn how to talk to each other by watching us, he said. What lesson are we teaching? Silence followed. Not awkward. Purposeful. The kind of silence that means people are thinking, not waiting to speak. The moderator finally thanked him genuinely, her voice carrying respect that couldn't be faked. Morgan nodded, appreciative but grounded. He didn't bask in it. He didn't need to. As the segment wrapped, the audience rose again, applause filling the studio with warmth instead of tension. Morgan stood this time, placing a hand briefly over his heart in thanks. The host stood too, some smiling softly, some visibly moved. Cameras captured it all, but even without them, the moment would have mattered. As the show transitioned to its next topic, the energy lingered. Conversations backstage buzzed with disbelief and admiration. The panel took their seats again, aware that something rare had just unfolded. Morgan Freeman hadn't silenced them by force. He'd silenced the noise, and in doing so, he'd changed the conversation. And as he prepared to leave the set later that morning, Morgan carried no sense of victory with him. Only a quiet satisfaction. He had spoken when it mattered, listened when it mattered more, and reminded a room built for talking what true dialogue actually sounded like. The episode ended, but the moment refused to. As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed slightly, the audience was still buzzing, voices overlapping, people turning to strangers beside them as if they had just witnessed something too important to keep quiet about. Morgan Freeman walked off the set slowly, surrounded by polite applause from crew members who usually stayed invisible. Some nodded at him with genuine respect. Others simply watched, aware they'd just been part of a broadcast that wouldn't fade when the screen went dark. Backstage, the hosts regrouped, their energy subdued, thoughtful. There was no post-show laughter, no quick jokes to release the pressure. One of them sat quietly, replaying the exchange in her head, realizing how rare it was to be challenged without being attacked. Another admitted softly that she hadn't expected the conversation to go there, but maybe it needed to. Producers whispered urgently, phones already lighting up with notifications. Clips were spreading faster than anyone could manage. Within minutes, social media ignited. Short videos of Morgan's raised finger, his calm, "let me finish," and his measured reflections flooded timelines. Comment sections filled with stunned reactions. Some called it a masterclass in communication. Others said it was the most powerful moment the show had aired in years. Even critics who often thrived on outrage struggled to twist the exchange into something ugly. There was no yelling to mock, no meltdown to sensationalize. Just silence, intention, and words that landed clean. News outlets picked it up before the hour was over. Headlines avoided exaggeration for once, choosing phrases like quiet authority and unexpected reckoning. Media analysts debated whether the moment signaled a shift in how audiences responded to televised confrontation. Ratings climbed as replays circulated. People who hadn't watched the show in years searched for the clip, curious about the calm that had somehow gone viral. Morgan Freeman, meanwhile, had already left the building. In the car ride away, he looked out the window, city passing by in a blur of motion and noise. He felt no triumph, no regret. Just calm. He hadn't set out to silence anyone. He had simply refused to be rushed, refused to be reduced, and the world had leaned in because of it. At his age, he understood that moments only matter if they ripple beyond you. This one already had. By evening, late-night hosts referenced it. Commentators slowed their tone, replaying the exchange frame by frame. Educators shared it in group chats, calling it a lesson in dialogue. Parents watched with their children. The phrase, "let me finish," trended, not as a punchline, but as a reminder. In a culture addicted to interruption, someone had modeled restraint, and people felt it in their bones. The View returned the next day to a different atmosphere. The panel opened acknowledging the conversation, thanking viewers for their responses. The hosts spoke more deliberately now, pauses longer, voices less eager to collide. Whether it lasted or not, something had shifted, if only briefly. The audience expected more now. Better. As for Morgan Freeman, he didn't comment publicly. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. It lived in the quiet between words, in the way millions of people recognized something they'd been missing without knowing how to name it. Respect. Listening. Presence. And that is why this moment matters. Not because someone was embarrassed. Not because a show was put in its place. But because for a few minutes, noise gave way to meaning, and the world stopped scrolling long enough to pay attention. Now it's your turn. What did you feel watching Morgan Freeman take control of that room without raising his voice? Did it change how you think about conversations, about television, about being heard? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters here. And if you want more explosive, emotional, cinematic stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Talk Flair right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see what real power looks like. We'll see you in the next story.